Hello, good evening, and welcome to Bangalore International Centre. BIC is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversation, intellectual dialogue, exchange of ideas, arts, and culture. Today's event is Caste Pride, Battles for Equality in Hindu India. In his book, Caste Pride, Manoj Mitta examines the endurance and violence of the Hindu caste system through the lens of the law. Linking 2 centuries of legal reform with social movements, he unearths the characters, speeches, confusions, and decisions that have shaped the war on caste, mitigating how this ancient institution discriminated between Hindus across the board. Today's session will begin with a short performance by singer and filmmaker Shabnam Virmani, followed by a presentation by the author Manoj Mitta. A panel discussion will follow. We request you to switch off your mobile phones or put them on silent. Kindly refrain from flash photography or videography. Ladies and gentlemen, Poems of Kabir on the theme of caste, a short performance by Shabnam Virmani.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Manoj, for giving me this little sweet opportunity to bring together the spirit, the poetic, the musical, juxtapose it with the legal, the socio-political. It takes me back to moments in my research journeys where in villages I would listen to mostly Dalit youth and men and women in satsang for Kabir, singing Kabir songs. And the gaze would wander up and there would Dr. Ambedkar be on the wall, juxtaposed right next to Kabir. And in conversation with them, it would transpire that जो हौसला बाबा अम्बेडकर ने हमें दुनिया में दिया, वो हौसला हमारे दिल में कबीर हमें देते हैं. So the outer and the inner come together, and I'll essentially just take 20 minutes to share a couple of songs, a few half songs, since time is limited, and a few thoughts about how I've heard Kabir's verses address the idea of caste or jat. So we'll start with the inimitable, mocking, challenging, power punch voice of Kabir, where he says, "Tu kas Brahman, hum kas Suda." Brahman means Brahman, Suda is Shudra. Meaning, how are you a Brahmin? तुम कैसे ब्राह्मण बन गए और हम कैसे सूदा? तू कस ब्राह्मण, हम कस सूदा, हम कस लहू, तुम कस दूधा. एक है हाड़ चाम मल मूता, एक है रुधिर एक गूदा, एक है बूंद से सृष्टि रची है, क्या ब्राह्मण क्या शूदा. What makes you a precious Brahmin and me a lower caste cur? Blood runs in my veins, does milk run through yours? One bone, skin, piss, shit. One blood, one gore. One drop creates us all. Who's high, who's low? Kabir. तू कस बामन, हम कस सूदा. वो 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 वो. तुम कस बामन, हम कस सूदा. हम कस लोहू, तुम कस दूधा. एक है हाड़ चाम मल मूता, एक रुधिर एक गूदा, एक है बूंद से सृष्टि बनी है, रे 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 को बामण को सूदा. Then of course he famously says, जात ना पूछो साधु की, पूछ लीजो ज्ञान. मोल करो तलवार की, पड़ी रहने दो म्यान. Don't ask about my caste. Instead, seek the wisdom in me. Why not grasp the sword itself and let the scabbard be? दुर्बल को ना सताइए, वाकी मोटी हाय. मुई खाल की सांस से लोहा भस्म हो जाए. Don't torment the weak. Potent is their sigh. High. उसकी हाय लग सकती है दुर्बल की. The breath of a lifeless bellow, खाल, can reduce iron to ash. घास के कबहू न निंदिए, पांव तले जे होए, उड़ी पड़े जब आंख में खरा दुहेला होए. You deem it lowly, the grass beneath your feet. Just one blade blown into your eye can bring you to your knees. So Kabir has these ideas of which clearly reflect a sort of a solidarity, a kinship, because वो खुद दलित वीवर ठहरे. दुर्बल को ना सताइए, वाकी मोटी हाय. मुई खाल की सांस से लोहा भस्म हुई जाए. हे जिरे लोहा भस्म हो जाए. तो घास के कब होना निंदिए, पाँव तले जे होए, उड़ी पड़े जब आँख में तो खरा दुहेला होए. And then comes the idea of the distinct idea that runs through a lot of Kabir songs and dohas is the denial of temple entry. So he will have songs that say, kai dhoondti phire mari heli. Like, what are you running and searching for? My heli, my sakhi. Ghat ghat mein Ram ji boleri. In your body itself, Ram speaks. Murat kor mandir ma meli. You carved a murti and you put it in a temple, yes. Va mukhade se kadi na boli. But it never spoke, it was mute. Diwan to darwaze thada. And there is a pandit standing guard at the door. Bina hukum kon khole ri. Kai dhoondti phiro meri heli. So there's this very endearing, intimate, sort of warm voice, a voice of kinship. Like, why are you struggling like this? Don't go there. In another poem he says, तीरथ में तो सकल सब पानी है, होए नहीं कछु नहाए देखा. प्रतिमा सकल तो जड़ है भाई, बोले नहीं बोलाए देखा. पुराण कुरान सब बातें हैं, ये घट का पर्दा खोल देखा. अनुभव की बात कबीर कहे यह, सब है झूठी पोल देखा. It's just plain water in your holy rivers. I've taken a dip in them and seen. All your idols are dumb blocks of stone. I've tried to talk to them and seen. Your sacred books, Puran and Quran, all are mere talk. I've lifted the veil within and seen. Kabir speaks from the ground of experience. All the rest is a lie. I've unmasked the scam and seen. So where does he call to the Dalit spirit and say, "Phir kya?" Neev bina hi dehura, aur deh bina hi dev. Kabir tahan rami gaya, kare alakh ki sev. With no foundation, a temple. With no body, a god. Kabir is at play here, devoted to an invisible Lord. So many songs from the tradition carry this call to the Anghadiya Deva, the unsculpted God, the unfabricated God. And many of the bhajans of the tradition will cock a snook at Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh. And characters from caste-ridden ideas in our epics. So Arjun will come in the fire, so will Ram, so will Krishna. And it's pretty in your face. I'm not going to sing this, but I'm going to sing a couple of choice lines from this song. Angadiya re deva, kaun karega thari seva? Angadiya re deva, kaun karega thari seva? Koi nahi karega thari seva. Angadiya re deva, kaun karega thari seva? Angadiya re deva, kaun karega thari seva? Who will worship you, O unsculpted God? You are revered by none, unfabricated God. They all scramble and pray at altars of form. No one gets wind of the unfragmented one. Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh. This you have to hear in Hindi. Brahma, Vishnu, Maheshwar Deva, unsir lagi kai. How many Hindi speakers here? Brahma, Vishnu, Maheshwar Deva, unsir lagi kai. You know what kai is? Fungus. उनके भरोसे कोई मत रहियो, उनके भरोसे कोई मत रहियो, उन्होंने मुक्ति नहीं पाई. अनगढ़िया रे देवा, कौन करेगा थारी सेवा? अनगढ़िया रे देवा, कौन करेगा थारी सेवा? So he's saying, Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva, their idols are overgrown with moss. Don't depend on them to get free. They themselves didn't make it across. They are not ours, the 10 avatars, though everyone calls them flawless. They're busy sorting their sordid karma. The true creator is someone else. Yogis and jogis, sages and seers, always creating a ruckus. Says Kabir, won't you listen, my friends? Seek the word, get free of the mess. So I'm going to sing a little bit of one song which has this call then. Okay, if you don't go there, then where do you go? He says, Begam ki gam kar le re hansa. Begam ki gam kar le. Begum has an interesting resonance with Begumpura, which is the city of without sorrow evoked by Ravidas. But here gum means entry. Gum, Begum, that place which is unapproachable actually. So he says, go my dear swan. Where? To that ungoable place. Pause. What's gone by, let go. Be free of the fear of come and go. There are no 12 deities, no sacred mountain, no chant, and even no chant. What will your mind dwell on, O swan? No earth, and yet a water wheel turns. No cloud or sky, yet rain. Taste this wine of the undying, O swan. Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh, they come and go, your gods. that invincible letter has no vowel, longer or lesser. Know that word by heart, O swan. Once gone, no return. Make this such a moment. Says Kabir, listen seekers, make a home here, in this land, O swan. कर ले रे हंसा बेगम की तू गम कर रे हाँ बेगम की गम कर ले रे हंसा बेगम की तू गम कर रे विगत करो बे गम मेरे वो विगत करो बे गम मेरे वो जन्म मरण को नहीं डर रे हंसा बेगम की तू गम कर रे नाथ दुआ दस है नहीं उनके ना कोई धरनी धर रे हाँ नाथ दुआ दस है नहीं उनके ना कोई धरनी धर रे जापा जापा है नहीं उनके जापा जापा है नहीं उनके तो सुमिरण किन का कर रे हंसा बेगम की गम कर रे हाँ ब्रह्मा रे विष्णु महेश्वर देवा तीनों आवा तो गमन रे ब्रह्मा रे विष्णु महेश्वर देवा तीनों आवा तो गमन रे उस अक्षर को लघु न मात्रा उस अक्षर को लघु न मात्रा वही शब्द रटा कर रे हंसा बेगम की गम कर रे बेगम की तू गम कर ले रे हंसा बेगम की गम कर रे वठे गयोड़ा फेर नहीं आया ऐसा अवसर कर रे वठे गयोड़ा फेर नहीं आया वैसा अवसर कर रे कहे कबीर सुनो भाई साधो कहे कबीर सुनो मेरे साधो उसी देश कर खर रे हंस बेगम की गम कर रे बेगम की तू गम कर रे बेगम की गम कर रे I'd like to share a poem which highlights Kabir's weaver status, because all these resonant voices, Ravidas is a leather worker, Chamar, Kabir is a weaver, these are all people working with their hands, and this evokes in their poetry a kind of material imagination. Kabir is always talking about the elemental. He is evoking the kumhar, he is invoking the gardener, he's invoking, in fact, God as carpenter, God as potter, God as master weaver. And often a lot of his poems, materials are speaking to him. The famous Mati Kahe Kumhar Se. So here's a poem. Ulati Jat Kul Do Bisari Shunya Sehaj Mahi Bunat Hamari Hamara Jhagda Raha na ko Pandit Mulla Chhade Do Buni Buni Aap पहरावूं जहां नहीं आप तहां होई गावूं पंडित मुल्ला जो लिखी दिया छाड़ी चले हम कछू न लिया हृदय खुलासू निरख ले मीर आज हूं खोजी खोजी मिले कबीर I turn around ulat this is such a difficult thing to translate. I turn around, I flip. There is a sudden reversal. I turn around. All memory fades of caste and kin. In spontaneous emptiness, I weave a self. Feuds fade, fuming, fulminating, pandits, mullahs, I leave them both. Weaving myself, this cloth I wear. Dissolving myself, singing, trashing Pandits' foretellings, mullahs' misgivings, I walk away. Look close, O Mir, with a heart unbound and utterly free. In this moment, I quest and find Kabir. So, this idea, if I'm not a Pandit, doesn't result in an assertion of Dalitness. Let's not make that mistake. Kabir will show solidarity with the Dalit, but his identity is somewhere else. I'd like to talk about this beautiful poem translated by Linda Hess, where she turns on the head, Kabir turns on the head the idea of untouchability. Who is untouchable? Who really is untouchable? Pandit, look in your heart for knowledge. Tell me where untouchability came from, since you believe in it. Mix red juice, white juice, and air. A body bakes in a body. As soon as the 8 lotuses are ready, it comes into the world. Then what's untouchable? 8,400,000 vessels decay into dust while the potter keeps slapping clay on the wheel and with a touch cuts each one off. We eat by touching. We wash by touching. From a touch, the world was born. So who's untouched? Asks Kabir. Only she who is free from delusion. I'd like to share the last 2 lines in Hindi. Chhoot se hi khana, chhoot se peena, chhoot se hi jag upjaya. Kahe Kabir, wo nar achhuta, jiske sang na maya. So, the idea, and I'm going to close now, what is the Jat that Kabir is identifying with? तो जात हमारी आत्मा और प्राण हमारा नाम, अलख हमारा इष्ट है और गगन हमारा गाँव. The soul, my caste, breath, the name I go by. The invisible, my beloved deity, and my hometown is the sky. तो पानी केरा बुदबुदा आसमानस की जात, देखत ही छिप जाएगा ज्यों तारा प्रभात. I didn't think I would put this in this inventory of poems about Jat, but I did because it struck me this is the nature, the Jat of all of us that Kabir continuously points us to, which is essentially and fundamentally ephemeral, fleeting as a water bubble, so the life of man, like a star spotted at dawn. It's here now, then gone. So I'm going to end with a little invocation of like a half song, because I know we need to get on to the main act of the day. The evocation, it's a sort of very poignant song, the evocation of a Begumpura, a sorrowless land, a kind of utopia, if you will. The poet Ladhu Nath is inviting his surta to go to the country of the sky. Halo gagan mandal ke des, Raja to pirja wahan nahi puge. It's a place beyond these hierarchies of king and subject. Nahi puge bhoop nares. No gods reach there. Kal jal jam wahan nahi puge. The web of time doesn't reach there. Puge na dukh aur kalesh. No sorrow, no sadness. Brahma और विष्णु जहाँ नहीं पूगे, न पूगे शेष महेश. लादू नाथ कहे सुनो भाई किसना ऐसा अखंडी देश. हालो सुरतम गगन मंडल रे देश. हालो सुरतम गगन मंडल रे देश. राजा तो फिर जा वहाँ नहीं पूगे. राजा और फिर जा वहाँ नहीं पूगे. ना पूगे भूप नरेश. ना पूगे भूप नरेश. हालो सुरता गगन मंडल रे देश. हालो सुरता गगन मंडल रे देश. काल जाल जम वहाँ नहीं पूगे. काल जाल जम वहाँ नहीं पूगे. पूगे ना दुख यार कलेश. पूगे ना दुख यार कलेश. हालो सुरता गगन मंडल रे देश. हालो सुरता गगन मंडल रे देश. गगन मंडल रे देश. ब्रह्मा रे विष्णु वहाँ नहीं पूगे. ब्रह्मा रे विष्णु वहाँ नहीं पूगे. पूगे ना शेष महेश. पूगे ना शेष महेश. हालो सुरता गगन मंडल रे देश. लादू नाथ कहे सुनो भाई किस लादूनाथ कहे सुनो मेरे किसना, ऐसा या खंडित ऐसा या खंडित हाल सुरता गगन मंडल रे हाल सुरता गगन मंडल रे हाल सुरता गगन मंडल रे Over to you, Manoj. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite the author, Manoj Mitta.
Thanks everyone for making it on a rainy day like this. I really appreciate your interest in this subject, and among the many people I should be thanking, I'll of course begin with her. Shabnam and I go back a long way. It took a great deal of persuasion to get her here because she was busy with other things, and I was very keen because there's a lot that happened in these debates that this book captures, legislative debates that sought to bring about caste reforms over the last 2 centuries, yes, from early colonial period onwards, where there were repeated references to this tradition of dissent being as indigenous as the Varna system, which one section, the influential section, the orthodox section, held to be inviolable. And any attempt to reform it or tinker with it was going to be hurting their religious sentiments and so on. So to counter that, very often the progressive section of legislators, very often they would be Hindus themselves, and not necessarily from a particular caste, they could be from anywhere. I mean, a lot of them were indeed Brahmins, as much as the votaries of Varna from the other side were. So there was this fascinating battle that was going on between 2 sets of Hindus, the orthodox ones and the progressive ones, where they sought to make out that this tradition of dissent was as indigenous, and there were repeated references to Kabir, Nanak and so on. One of the expressions that they often used, she came pretty close to saying the thing. I guess one of the poems you sang dealt with this expression. He would say, we are all, I mean, he dealt with both the issues of communal harmony. He would remain ambiguous till the end about his religious identity, because the whole point of it was he was seeking to unify the 2 communities by urging them to rise above these notions of religion or whatever comes with that. And he was also engaged with this question of caste, being himself somebody who identified with and who belonged to a lower caste, right? So he used this expression that we were all, that everybody was made, were pots of the same clay. This was something which he derived from the tradition of, in his whole attempt to, when he was being invoked by these legislators during the colonial period, it was to say that, look, this is something that we derive directly from Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism and so on and so forth. These, and then the other side would say, okay, the scriptures you are quoting also talk of Varna. So, there was this genius that Hindu scriptures had of saying one thing, which is all about equality. We are all, instruments of the same God. We have the same divinity, every one of us. So, whether you are a Brahmin or a Shudra or a Dalit or a Muslim, it's the same divinity that pervades you. So, how can you be othering somebody or oppressing somebody? There is that, which comes directly from several scriptures. And then you have these legislators holding forth with great conviction that, look, those very scriptures talk about Varna and its inviolability and so on and so forth. So this contradiction would keep coming up, whether we are talking about reforming this intercaste, not reforming intercaste marriage, but the restrictions on intercaste marriage, doing away with that, or temple entry, or giving Dalits access to public spaces. So this is something that repeatedly came up. So that was the reason why I was so keen on her being here. And the next person I would really like to thank is, I've had a few book events, but this is the first time that these two very special persons are here. One is Ajita, where are you? She was the one who edited my book, worked on it, so I owe a great deal to her. But before she came into my life, the person who really helped me think big, the ambition and the audacity of the book, I owe really to the support and guidance I received from Ram Guha, who I'm deeply grateful to him for making it on a day like this. It meant a lot because this was so different from anything we know of. We assume about various aspects of caste. So I needed some kind of assurance from an expert, an eminent person like him, on whether I'm on the right track. He never had a moment's hesitation about whether I should continue to work on it. Essentially because he appreciated the fact that it was all based on these previously unseen legislative and judicial records. So there can't be really anything more authentic than that. It's not as if I'm selectively picking up stuff from some letter or some diary or speeches elsewhere. It's all very official, right? So this was something that I'm very grateful to him for. And as far as the story behind the book is concerned, he did this hand-holding because I was lucky enough to get a fellowship from the Bangalore-based New India Foundation. And that was one big boon for me in this journey. And before that, there was another fellowship which took me to US. And there I met, it was quite a turning point for me, which is that I met somebody called Mark Galanter. Only those who are from the legal field might be familiar with him. He is somebody who urged me to, think big, because he was of the view that, whatever little work he did, that's how he perceived it, is that I see it as pioneering work he did on the intersection of law and caste. There's a great deal of work done on caste, and of course there's a great deal of work on law per se, all in a very instrumental sense perhaps, but nothing on the intersection of law and caste. And he was struck by the fact that if anybody were to attempt a book on, say, the intersection of law and race, you will struggle to come up with anything substantially new on the subject, because it's so thoroughly researched, studied, written about, so much so that it is there in their school textbooks also, the milestones of how that democracy came to terms with the issue of equality vis-a-vis race and so on. But when it comes to, they have a whole lot of very fascinating stories in US on the intersection of law and race. We have similar stories which were never told. And these records I'm referring to, they were all hidden in plain sight. They were there in the very archives and libraries that scholars throng. But somehow they remained untold, they remained unexplored. So I just got it into my head to do it. And but it took a while for me to come there. I started out with a very modest venture, which is that, given my background as a journalist who's specialized in law, human rights and social justice issues, and having written a couple of books on mass violence targeting minorities. The first one was about the 1984 Delhi carnage, and the second one was 2002 Gujarat carnage. So I wanted to complete a trilogy on mass violence, this time focusing on caste violence, mass violence targeting Dalits. And the difference being that in the case of communal violence, there's no special law, but here there's some 1989 law which is allegedly draconian and so on. And yet, there's so little by way of justice. Why is there so much impunity despite this special law which some people go to the extent of saying needs to be repealed? And another thing that struck me was, in the lifetime of, say, somebody like Gandhi, who in his own way, devoted himself to eradicating untouchability, or somebody like Ambedkar, in a very different way, given the fact that he comes from a different background, and they had ideological differences which we are all familiar with. Now, in the lifetime of these two main antagonists of untouchability, or those who were trying to overcome this deeply ingrained prejudice, in their own lifetime, they never encountered the kind of violence, the sheer scale of violence that we have seen in recent decades. It's something that never happened. There was a lot of everyday prejudice, everyday violence on a one-on-one basis. But nothing like what we saw in 1968, which makes it after even Nehru's lifetime. Nehru passed away in 1964. In 1968, there was this first instance of mass violence targeting Dalits in a place called Kilvenmani. That really set the template for the nature of violence, where you suddenly attack a vulnerable set of Dalits in their hamlet or wherever, and whatever the reason may be, the provocation may be. And then how the system, the state machinery responds to it. Remember, by then we've had a great deal of rhetoric about abolishing untouchability, and we have put in place a law to provide penalties for that and so on. And when this episode took place, court after court had no qualms in acquitting all of them, all the accused. And they would come up with the flimsiest of reasons, something about how, people who are so well off, people who own cars, couldn't possibly have engaged in violence, couldn't possibly have accompanied these mobsters and so on and so forth. So, that really set the tone for how the system, the state mechanism was responding to these cases. So I wanted to examine that. Lots of cases followed. So I was looking at all those. And in the course of my own professional life, very often Bihar was much in news. So I even visited Bihar to see what was happening there. Why, for instance, after trial courts would convict a whole lot of people, say in a case like Lakshmanpur Bate in 1997 or 1996 Batani Tola, the High Court would go on to acquit all of them. So we have had, it was not as bad as Kilvenmani, where all the courts more or less acquitted. Here, there was an instance of one layer actually convicting. And in Lakshmanpur Bate's case, as many as 18 people, the highest number of death penalties in any given case in the country, more than even in Godhra. There were that many convictions, and yet when the same matter went before the High Court, all of them without exception were acquitted. And in the case of Batani Tola, all the 20-odd people were all killed in one room. They were all mostly women and children. And the court's decision was, and it accepted the defense counsel's contention, that these victims, these witnesses could not be trusted, because if they were indeed around, they couldn't have been alive. The very fact that they were alive makes their testimony suspect. The court went to the extent of disbelieving even one woman who was in that room where all these people were killed, and she had her injuries to show her presence, and that's normally in law taken as evidence that gives that assurance that the victim was indeed there on the spot, and even her testimony was disbelieved. So where was this kind of attitude coming from? It seemed that some arm or the other of the Indian state was very brazenly betraying caste prejudice. Now, I found that something very challenging and very dissatisfactory to be just reporting these cases and leaving it to the reader to figure out what was happening. So I had this great need in me to go into where this was coming from. So I looked up the debates relating to untouchability, the abolition of untouchability in the Constituent Assembly. And then there were references to what happened during the colonial period. So I kept digging further back. And a whole lot of, a treasure trove of new material came to light. And that was when, this was all in the course of my fellowship with the New India Foundation. So I was a little disconcerted because it was taking me into areas which are pre-colonial, colonial period and not post-colonial. And it was taking me into, I was widening the ambit, so is that right? So that's when Ram played a big role. And when I look back at it, it was really well worth the trouble. And his support was very critical at that moment because a whole lot of new material came. And I'll end with just an explanation of why, this new material that helped me understand why we still have this kind of an attitude. It ranges from being very brazen about denying them justice to believing or having this delusion that, caste is a thing of the past. By talking about it, by being obsessed with it, you are actually, making us think about it. Otherwise, which guy in his senses deals with, thinks of caste anymore. There's this kind of notion. So why this was important to me was that, look, I'm not suggesting that there is a causative link I'm drawing between what happened in the colonial period, in these debates, in these attempts to reform caste aspects in different ways, to what was happening in places like Kilvenmani or Lakshmanpur Bate and the impunity that followed. But there is surely some kind of a correlation. Why do I say so? Because these battles remained unresolved. So one example I would like to cite, and that's the point on which I'd like to end, which is, let's take this example of the first ever intercaste bill introduced by Vittalbhai Patel. His brother, of course, is better known, younger brother, Sardar Patel. Now, when he introduces that and says, let's legalize intercaste marriage, why was he doing so? Because, any marriage that takes place between different varnas was considered illegal, and the offspring of those marriages were illegitimate. So he strategically cites examples affecting, such intercaste marriages among upper castes, between a Brahmin woman and a Kshatriya man. And he points out, look, when that man abandons her, she has no remedy. Why? Because her marriage to begin with is illegal, and her children cannot have any legal status. So for God's sake, let's address this. But then the response from the other side was, how dare you tinker with our, long entrenched notions of, these lines we don't cross. And who were these people? That's a bit of a surprise, because these were, this was the Hindu right we talk about didn't exist then as we know today. Because, say, RSS came into existence only in 25, and this was happening in 1918, right? So those who were of this conservative bent of mind were very much in the Congress stream, and they continued to be there for a few more decades. So the ones who, Vittalbhai Patel himself was from Congress stream, and the ones who were pushing back were also from Congress. There were people like Madan Mohan Malviya, who famously got Bharat Ratna the year Modi came to power, and somebody like Surendranath Banerjee. And it was not just confined to people in what was called Imperial Legislative Council, a precursor to Parliament, but there were also people from outside, voices from outside, like Gandhi, who expressed dissent on this bill, who said, look, why should Vittalbhai Patel be talking about intercaste at a time like this, when our priority is to attain independence, when we should all be unifying? Why raise these divisive issues? So he might have had his own good reasons to think the way he did. And the way I have attempted to write is, I tried to be true to my training as a journalist. I decided to be a kathavachak, a storyteller, where I'm dealing with a mountain of information. So my big challenge is to sort of summarize it, find a narrative, tell stories of what happened on different aspects of caste. This being just one of them. There were other things like, do we need to necessarily have a Brahmin priest to sanctify our marriage? These are issues that were agitated in the 19th century by the likes of Phule, when he came up with the Satyashodak form of marriage, which dispensed with Brahmin priests, and he fought a case all the way up to the High Court, and he, against all odds, in the year he went on to die, he had the satisfaction of, achieving that victory, that Satyashodak form of marriage against all odds was upheld. And then decades later, somebody like Periyar takes up that cause in his part of the country. He calls it as self-respect form of marriage, or Suya Maryade. And then it goes through all sorts of trials and tribulations. Madras High Court strikes it down. Rajaji is asked to do something about it. He hems and haws, does nothing. Then it was only finally when Annadurai government formed in 67, they make an amendment to the Hindu Marriage Act, a central law. So there's a local amendment in Tamil Nadu. So all these battles come to life, and which give you a sense of how real and how disconcerting these issues were, and they were as important to these people of that era as the issue of freedom struggle. It's another matter that freedom fighters don't necessarily overlap with these equality champions. We know more about freedom fighters because it was, that's the dominant narrative, in which there's so much of demonization of the colonial structure that we don't recognize that whatever opportunities they gave post, constitutional reforms like, Montagu-Chelmsford reforms and all that, when there was greater representation in legislative bodies, and somebody like Willingdon on his own, this was even before this reform comes into force in 1920-21, he in 1919 anticipates this reform and comes up with this gesture of nominating a Dalit, the first ever Dalit legislator anywhere in the country. It was one M.C. Raja. Now, this was a revolutionary step. Why? Because suddenly these legislators who are all from what they call caste Hindu background would have to, like in the case of any legislator, refer to him as honorable member. Suddenly, somebody whose very presence is polluting to us. How do we do that? So this kind of, how this ingrained prejudice is affecting every notion of reform. When our legislators, this was post-independence now, when they were discussing the need to penalize untouchability. So, before independence, there was a great deal of struggle about whether, we should allow that to be a cognizable offense, meaning should a Dalit who is aggrieved be allowed to just walk up to the police station and say, look, my rights have been denied. So, no, that would be going too far. People who have been conditioned for centuries to believe that it is their religious duty to keep somebody belonging to a certain caste away from him because his presence would be contaminating to him. So how do you now overnight turn that into my religious belief, my religious practice into a crime? So these are issues that these people are all grappling with, and how, there were all sorts of objections raised, and how the compromises that were made would all give us a sense of where we are today. To understand the state of play in today's India, it is indeed very helpful, very instructive to see how these champions of equality over 2 centuries fought on these various aspects. So I'll stop at this point, and we will now come to the panel discussion. So over to Jayna, who will be helming this discussion. Thank you very much, Jayna and Sudipto and Asshna, for your gesture of agreeing to participate in this panel discussion. I really appreciate that. And thank you very much, BIC, for hosting this event. It means a lot. Thank you.
I would like to call on the rest of our panel, Assistant Professor of Law, NLSIU, Asshna Singh, Executive Editor, The News Minute, Sudipto Mondal, and our moderator, Senior Advocate and Co-founder, CLPR, Jayna Kothari.
So thank you, Manoj, for that wonderful, the story behind the book, what led to it, and I think giving all of us a good overview of it. I think, since all the introductions have been done, we can jump right into it. I think the importance of a book like yours today really cannot be overstated. As a lawyer, we have 2 lawyers and 2 journalists on the panel, so it's quite equal. I think as a lawyer, for people who are interested on caste equality issues, an issue that is very, very much as relevant today as it was earlier, the access and the stories behind not just our constitutional framework, which sometimes we get from our Constituent Assembly debates, but also the legislative history and the legal history that you have pulled out in the book. How many of the legislative reforms were introduced, what were some of the conversations, what led finally, prior to even the Constituent Assembly debates, what led to some of these claims for caste equality, which led to Article 17, 15, and 16 in our Constitution. A lot of these stories come out. And I think these stories are important for all of us to read, to really see what the crucial debates were and what were those arguments. And not just the legal debates, but also the reforms, the social movements that went along at that time, which ultimately led to these legal reforms. So I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book, so thank you for that. I have what we've designed, the discussion today is that all of us will try and speak to crucial parts of the book and hopefully respond to that, and then have a round of questions from the audience. I'll start first if that's okay. So one of the things that actually really I found very, very interesting, you alluded to some of it, was on the issue of marriage reform and intercaste marriage. That forms a big chunk of the book. And you write and refer in your book about the various kinds of marriage law reforms. And one of the core issues around maintaining caste structures had been the ban on intercaste marriage. The idea that intercaste marriage would not be permitted, would not be accepted legally. And then the movements in different parts of the country to recognize intercaste marriage. And you spoke about some of it, but especially in Tamil Nadu, Periyar's self-respect movement, which introduced the Suya Maryada marriage, or self-respecting marriages, which not just did away with Brahmins officiating them, but the fact that you could have marriage across castes and marriage on the basis of equality. Going through some of this, which also led, as you pointed out, to the introduction in Tamil Nadu, which I didn't know, and I'm sure a lot of us didn't know about, an introduction to an amendment in the law called the Hindu Non-Conforming Marriage Registration Bill, which was ultimately accepted. A lot of this legal history, I would just like to contextualize it. For those who've been following in the Supreme Court over the last few weeks, there have been debates. There have been a constitutional challenge seeking marriage equality for recognition, legal recognition of marriage under the Special Marriage Act for all persons, irrespective of sexual orientation and gender identity. And a large basis for seeking this marriage equality under the Special Marriage Act has been on the claim of equality and on the claim that the Special Marriage Act is a secular law, and the early battles for marriage equality were on the basis of caste, to remove barriers to intercaste marriages. And we relied on some of the debates which led to the introduction of the Special Marriage Act. and some of those debates where the legislators spoke that intercaste marriages have now been accepted and been legalized and legally recognized, and how do we ensure that these hurdles are not there? And so, therefore, I would say that some of these developments are so relevant even today. I mean, the same arguments made for recognition of intercaste marriages, to recognize equality within marriage, to recognize equality across castes, to recognize that they may not conform to the Hindu religious form, but they need legal recognition. Had we had access to your book and some of your materials, I would definitely say that this would have made a great contribution to, I'm sure, some of the arguments that we put forward in the marriage equality case at the Supreme Court. And just before I kind of end, there was just 2 paras that I would like to kind of refer to, which you write in your book. When the bill that you referred to by Vithalbhai Patel, when he wanted to introduce the bill, and what happened at that time. So I'll just read out 2 paras. You write that the ensuing turbulence polarized Hindu society, inducing some of the tallest leaders of the time to weigh in on the bill. On 19th December 1918, Rabindranath Tagore extended his heartiest support to Patel's initiative, saying, and it's quoted, "It is humiliating to find that some of our countrymen are opposing this bill under the notion that it will injure Hindu society if it is passed." Calling such reaction a libel against the spirit of Hinduism, Tagore said that the religion had actually been allowing mixture of castes and making new social adjustments from the time of the Mahabharata. To Tagore's mind, the resistance to intercaste marriage laid bare a contradiction in the freedom struggle. Where society is terribly effective in its weapons of persecution, it is shameful to appeal to a foreign government to stiffen by its sanction a social tyranny, to rob people of their right to the freedom of conscience, and in the next moment to ask from the same government a wider political emancipation. And I found that particularly poignant because, we're still fighting these same battles of freedom today, right? Aren't we? Not only have we not seen, despite these reforms, not only have we not seen a rise in intercaste or interfaith marriages, which I think statistics still show that it's about 3% in India today. And we have new laws which, in fact, are making interfaith or intercaste marriages more difficult. But we're also seeking larger claims for marriage equality. So I found that particularly relevant. So thank you for that. Maybe I'll move on to Sudipto. Sudipto, okay, either.
We are in Bangalore, not Lucknow. Pehle aap.
I'll move on to Sudipto. There's a large part in the book, a large section looks at not just legal reforms, but also social movements that took place hand in hand with the legal reforms. There was the Wycombe struggle and many other social movements that he covers to end caste segregation. And there are also, I think the legal reforms also had its own history of both, the British introducing some of it and the freedom fighters from India. So how do you kind of look at some of these developments and your thoughts on it?
Yeah. Firstly, though, of course, I wish I'd finished the book before coming here. The elections kept us a little busy. But I couldn't put it down, and I'm going to take a couple of days off maybe, to just sit and read this and finish this. And I'm very excited by this book because of how it contributes to anti-caste polemic, anti-caste rhetoric, anti-caste politics, right? In terms of the points we make rhetorically, here you have an empirical, a factual, an actual, an archival reference for all of that, and that's what is exciting for me over here. For instance, we talk about how if it weren't for the British, we would have never seen the light of day, right? And they were the first anti-caste revolutionaries in that sense. There were people before that who, well, you know, in the name of reform, in the name of so many things, you know, it was basically things going around in cycles. You know, even when we talk about Veerashaivism or the Bhakti movement and all of these things, had a tendency to kind of absorb more than reject and reshape rather than replace. So in that sense, I feel like there are many moments in these chapters where the British take a step, a decisive step, saying that this far and no more. And that for me is very exciting because of also of the fact that British morality was going through a churn, had been going through a churn over at least, so we are looking at 18, 19, those years, because you look at the law of stocks, for example, right? Do you want to talk about the law of stocks first so that I can, you know, or do you want me to just go on? How do you think? Go on? Okay, so law of stocks, basically lower caste people, particularly untouchables, would be confined to the stocks. Now this...
you need to explain what stocks is. It's not
okay, yeah, do that, no, please.
Okay, it's a Western form which has a Western form of punishment which has biblical roots, where the convicted person is confined to a wooden block in which there are holes for his feet to be put. So it's a form of subjecting him to corporal punishment and also humiliating, because he would be very often put in public space. And somewhere along the line, Thomas Munro, who's otherwise a very popular governor of Madras, popular because he knew very strategically that the way the society is structured is you get these elite castes on your side, then you will have the rest under control. So, you know, in keeping with this caste prejudice and untouchability, he comes up with this innovation of importing stocks, which it's not indigenous at all, it's not part of our tradition. He imports that. In 1816, it's part of Section 10 of Madras Regulation of 1816. And it is in force for about 100 years. And that's what he was referring to.
Yeah, so how did that go away in England? I mean, it happened because of these churnings that were happening over there, starting with what Anne Boleyn did, right? And in terms of just like flipping that whole thing and distancing from the Catholic Church at a time when, you know, the debate was, should the Bible be in English or should it be in Latin, right? And then people were being put up on the stakes, being killed for reading the English Bible, right? And there's so many parallels for me over here, because what is happening now with the rejection of the Vedas, the Sanskritic ethos, you know, similar things are happening out there, and perhaps at a greater pace. And all of that culminates in this pushback against Monroe by people in his own establishment, British officers who are feeling like this is not who we are, this is not our moral system, this goes against humanity. The same humanity which was defined differently in the times of Boleyn and, you know, how she dies, all of those things. And also the establishment of the church.
Particularly because it was reserved for lower castes.
Exactly.
I mean, that is what they found it very offensive.
Yeah.
And same British establishment later.
So this working class ethos in the British establishment, how it comes through.
But then to be fair, there were also these reformers among Indians by then who had entered legislatures who were exposed to this.
Exactly, because motion. One of the things I put down over here is that...
they were not necessarily lower caste people. In fact,
the
one who campaigned was Narasimha's Iyer.
Yeah. Right, so that's the other thing which I found interesting, because finally there's some reluctance on the part of the British administrator in Travancore. You know, he's going on, so this is the breast tax or the... No.
There's not...
The breast tax was... the breast tax.
Breast tax. It's about forbidding women of lower caste, that is Nadars, who were called Shanars then, from covering their breasts in the style in which upper caste, especially Nayars, covered their breasts. It was what was called shoulder cloth. So there was actually a proclamation to the effect that you are forbidden to cover your breasts. And it was by an administrator who was the best known Indian administrator of the 19th century, Madhav Rao, who went on to, because he was so popular, who went on to become the first president of Indian National Social Conference, an offshoot of Congress, where reforms were being discussed. The irony should not be lost sight of. So the man who actually issued a proclamation in Travancore forbidding lower caste women to cover their breasts, he was forced to then recant and reform that because of the intervention of one governor of Madras, Trevelyan, who was a brother-in-law, by the way, of Macaulay, and he was in fact the original proponent of the view that Indians needed to be introduced this English education. And Macaulay, as the law member, he plays the decisive role in siding with his brother-in-law and others, and that's how we got that law. So later he becomes governor of Madras, and he says, this is not how we do at all. And all in the name of Queen Victoria's proclamation. And you are forbidding, you are not allowing members of her gender to cover their breasts because somebody takes offense to that. So.
And actually, that's a section in which I hope you would have looked a little bit at the role of the evangelists in that Cape region, where this, the Shanar revolt, where it happened, right? We're looking at Kanyakumari, and the role of the missionaries, I didn't see much of that, because there was a lot of, yes, they came, with the sword in one hand and the Bible in the other, as Tutu said, like the colonial this thing. But there was also this very strong focus on the anti-caste movements, and that, of course, finally, when you look at
that reform process, what they did was they said, okay, because this issue was first raised by missionaries, so they said these Shanars, as they were called, Nadar women, when they convert, they are still being forbidden to cover their breasts, and that is something very un-Christian. We cannot allow this to happen. So when Christian women were being allowed to cover their breasts, they were told, okay, you can wear a jacket, or you can wear some form of cover which will not be mistaken for an upper caste woman. Their whole obsession was that in the South, this is again something that may come as a revelation to many of us who are, despite being in the South, that the level of untouchability in the South was at a different level. It was the worst part of India. So much so that when Vivekananda was traveling around the country, he called the Kerala part, when he entered Malabar area, he said this whole area is a lunatic asylum, because it's not just untouchability, you have something known as unapproachability. And in some parts there was even unseeability. Your very sight is polluting to me. I said, we've never came across anything like that in other parts of the country. So it was in that context, we have to appreciate that it took this role, that it was important for them. When some woman is coming, I need to know for sure to which caste she belonged, because this whole thing was so finely worked out that if you are a member of this caste, then you have to maintain this much distance from Nambudris, or this much distance from Nayars. If you are from that caste, then it's all worked out, how many paces you have to keep, which is the context in which...
So on one side, you have to keep that much distance. On the other hand, you are free access.
Yeah.
You are free access, right? The Nayar man cannot, enter the Nambudri's house, but you can enter anybody else's house. And for me, in a rhetorical sense, almost in a narrative sense, or because there are poems and narratives and literature around this stuff, and there's also political speeches on this stuff, right? So this thing of how you mark out people for treatment, right? So they are dressed a certain way, they are from this particular community, so I can have my way here, but I can't have my way there. This is a way of marking out people with whom you can have your way. And particularly in the case of Kerala, for me it's very, very important because of this counter narrative. Like, for example, recently Stalin and Pinarayi, the two chief ministers, commemorated the Shanar revolt by going to Kanyakumari. And sure enough, there is a slightly soupy kind of counter narrative that comes, saying that to connect the breast tax with sexual degradation is not correct, because Kerala was a sexually liberated place, right, where these kind of morals were actually a Victorian import. And back then, most of the women didn't cover their bosoms. you know. And that takes away I mean, whether or not that is true and how they dressed and all that is separate. But the fact is that this was a tool to identify women who were fair prey also. And this is not something I'm saying, but this is part of the narratives, the political narratives that have emerged out of these movements. So that for me is very important. And it also allows me to say this other thing, which is that when we say that caste and endogamy is something that defines caste, right? In that sense, caste is a form, an artificial barrier to the free flow of sexuality, right? When we talk about sexuality today, thanks to other movements, we talk about it being fluid. So if it is fluid, this is an artificial barrier, a dam on that river, which cannot but pervert it, cannot but spoil the ecosystem, cannot but lead to these kind of perverse, sexually perverse kind of symbols of oppression, right? The other thing is, you know, again, this is again an extrapolation. I hope it passes muster. But you know, the thing of how we talk about trauma as intergenerational, but perversion and these kind of things are also carried from one generation to another to another. We see that in the way Dalit women are violated even today. It's not just as simple as she's raped. You know, it is the details, the degradation, the mindset which goes into it, which is far more worthy of study than the actual thing. Okay, which sections of the IPC did it cover? So that's one thing that it evokes for me. You know, that thing. The other chapter where you go into this Brahmin versus non-Brahmin, Brahmin, Shudra, and Kshatriya. So interesting, because there are all these people who are claiming that they are Kshatriya, but then suddenly they realize, no, I can't do that, so I have to claim a Shudra identity. Because there is a Rajput who is saying that I am Kshatriya, so I have right of inheritance. And that is challenged, saying that no, you're not worthy because your mother is from a lowered caste, and because of which you cannot be a Kshatriya. To which he says, okay, yes, I am Shudra. Okay, and among Shudras, intercaste marriage is allowed. We are a little more liberal about these things. So therefore, you know, because it's a legal battle, it's a matter in court where his inheritance is being questioned.
And among Shudras, illegitimate children also can inherit.
But not right. So this kind of leads me to think about how really everybody is involved in this one-upmanship, in this this fight to get to the top of the shit pile, no? Because these narratives of past glory, of having been some kind of aristocracy in the past, is not exclusive to just these Shudra communities, right? In Tamil Nadu itself, we have the Devendra Kula Velalar, or the Pulayas have narratives, the Mahars have narratives, the Rajbongshi of Bengal have these narratives of having in one pristine past been rulers, subordinated because of defeat in battle or whatever, and today are Avarna, outside the village. And this connects back to me for me very interestingly to how Ambedkar himself talks about the origins of untouchability, where he talks about the untouchables being broken men, right? People who, so he talks about settled communities and these nomadic invading communities. So once you have a settled community defeated by these people, they would take the women and the cattle and kill as many men as they could. Those who would escape with whatever they had would take shelter with a neighboring kingdom or a chieftain or some power center and live on the fringes of that settlement, right? And over time, he says that this is something that is not just unique to India, it's how power has really played out over the centuries between settled communities and nomadic communities, the Mongols and all that. The unique thing about India is that it got codified into caste. In other countries, you would still be able to, over generations, slowly integrate into the village, into that society. So this is something that immediately gets, triggered for me, in terms of imagery, of this literally timeless battle between all the other people and the timelessness of the Brahmin, right? You have him as the metaphysical center of power. Everything else is relative to it. You could from a Shudra, you could become a Kshatriya, vice versa. All of that can happen. But this unchanging center right? For me, that is really the thing to focus on. It is something that you can have endless examples of. No, like if you look at the Shudra and Kshatriya battle and the Brahmin in between, Rama is accused in some parts of Brahman Hatya by killing Ravana, because Ravana is a Brahmin, right? And Rama is actually a Shudra in that interpretation. In the Mahabharata, there is no Kshatriya. If you look at it if you technically analyze the lineage, they say Nadi Mula, Rishi Mula, Huduk Bardo. I know those of you who are Kannadiga here. You should not go looking for the origin of a river or the origin of somebody's lineage. If you go into the origins of people, the characters in Mahabharata, whether it's Bhim, whether it is Arjun, who their progenitors are, it really gets confusing. And literally, the clan of the Kuru is the clan of Vyasa, who has already been polluted because of. Anyway, I'm not going there, but I'm just saying that how timeless this is and how it plays out here for that. And also, the key, okay, so Ambedkar says that caste is a multi-storied building in which there are no staircases. Now, this proves that. It shows that there is a staircase, that staircase is lined with blood, that the way from one station to the other is violence. Right? Killing, chopping, going with that bloody knife to that Brahmin, saying, I won the battle, now anoint me the sovereign. Right? So that endless battle for me is what this chapter really evokes for me. This who is Shudra, who is Kshatriya. Have I missed something? Yeah, politics is violence by another means. I mean, today we see the same thing, right? With Siddaramaiah, the great Ahinda leader, Pinrai, the great Shudra, the Stalin, all of these people. The entire post-Mandal politics of India, right? Where you're talking about people who have contested and cooperated with Brahmins, with Brahminism, with Sanskritism, alternatingly. So that's my thing. When I finish, we'll have a talk on the phone.
Thank you.
So Asshna, I thought I'll ask you for your responses on the chapters on untouchability, which led to the abolition of untouchability in our constitution, both under 17 and Article 15, leading to non-discrimination on the basis of caste. And the legal histories, the legislative reforms that went before that, for prohibiting, the disabilities on the ground of caste, civil disabilities in public places, segregation and untouchability. So would you, and the way Manoj has kind of covered that in the book, your responses on that?
I'd like Manoj sir to elaborate on later about the legislative history related to abolition of caste. But I want to go into what Dr. Ambedkar wrote about the system of caste being a legal system. So he characterizes the Hindu law, the social law at the time, as the written constitution. He says this is the law of the land. And this is how some people are at the receiving end, some of them are suffering, and some of them have only rights, the others have only duties, the latter being the untouchables. So he's tracing this problem to be not just a social problem, but also a legal problem. So he's saying that, this idea of untouchability is essentially also a legal problem, which arises out of this social condition, which is the caste society. So he goes back to the origin of the problem. Where is the problem coming from? Which is from the Brahminical scriptures. And he characterizes the problem as legal as well as social. But his idea of characterization of this problem as being legal is very, very important in my view. So I think that is what went into his mind when he was not just drafting Article 17, but also drafting such a bulky constitution. That, he wanted everything to be written down there so that sufferings of the untouchables could be avoided in the future. Because otherwise he makes a distinction between rule and principle. And he says that, the Hindu law, the Hindu social law, however you want to understand it, but for him it was the law of the land, is a matter of a set of rules. which one must follow without the application of one's mind, which is what had corrupted the society and the Hindu legal system, right? So he says that this is a very bad law. Okay, and then he says that, we should change, therefore we should change the law. So this is a very sophisticated argument that he makes. That if we look at Article 17 and Article 15, in that light, I think we'll be able to better appreciate what was going on in his mind when we look at his other writings as well. And what was the other part of your question? Yeah.
No, just your responses to some of the early legal reforms
Yeah.
to seek abolition of untouchability before it led to
Yeah.
constitutional freedom.
That I'd like Sir to elaborate on. And I think I just want to add also, when Article 17 was being drafted, we can see from the debate how a lot of the credit for abolition of untouchability was being given to Gandhi as opposed to Ambedkar. So that is one point. And also, abolition is just it's one baby step. What Dr. Ambedkar had in mind was basically annihilation of caste. And I think when we read Sir's book, which is more about incremental reforms and how so much had to be done for, that little representation to be given. And that is when one Ambedkar was born, and he also struggled so much to get that opportunity to enter these legislative forums and then legislate about caste. So I think to bring about that radical transformation of the Hindu legal system through the constitution, it's almost like he rewrote the constitution in some way, if we consider that the pre-existing constitution was the Hindu legal order. So his project is still incomplete, because what we are actually aiming for is annihilation of caste, and abolition is just like one small step when it comes to that.
Would you like to respond before we go on to...
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, briefly.
I noticed that I'll be brief, both you and Asshna were referring to, 14, 15, 16, and 17, where, it's very obviously about caste, combating this inequality and untouchability and so on. What is often lost sight of, and I tried to highlight that in a chapter, is that even this freedom of religion provision, Article 25, because of the nature of our religion, that is Hinduism, has had a very peculiar feature, which is that after saying that there shall be freedom of religion or conscience, there was a need that our founding fathers felt to clarify in the next clause of that provision of that article, that provision basically says that in the case of Hindu temples, all Hindus shall have the right to access them. Now, this would be taken to be a bit of a non sequitur. Would you not think that in the case of a church, all Christians would have access to it, free access to it? In the case of a mosque, all Muslims, all people who believe in that religion, who are adherents of that religion, will have access to a place of worship of that religion. It's a given. It's something you take for granted. So it's something it's a bit of a telltale clause that we had to introduce. Why? Because of this long history during the colonial period, where, even someone like Gandhi, who during the 20s was very much a votary of, Varna, had difficulty in accepting this demand that, untouchables, avarnas, should be given access. Because he didn't want to do anything that was too radical, too far ahead of what society at large was ready. He believed in this ripeness theory. Let's do it so let's prepare the ground through satyagraha and other methods, and then resort to legislation. So these unresolved battles, you will see in the form of this very telltale clause there, which effectively says that freedom of religion does not mean that, Hindus can perpetuate their practice of barring members of certain castes from entering temples. So that is something that constitution will not permit. So you had to introduce this kind of clause, which is indicative of the kind of battles that were fought, and therefore that need for us to know what is happening. 25(2) is there in today's constitution, right? So where is this coming from? Why do we have this very peculiar requirement of clarifying that all Hindus will have access to Hindu temples, right? So this is the background that I bring out in the form of those battles that were fought during that colonial period. Do I rest?
No.
Yeah,
Also, I
sorry.
think just the meaning of untouchability, which is so unclear even till now, and even at that time, they had to put it in quotes to sort of bring to light the fact that untouchability has a certain context, and it's not just any kind of untouchability, as in it's different from the idea of purity pollution. So that purity pollution construct exists even within the upper caste, but untouchability is something that is practiced against certain castes, the avarnas by the savarnas. So that contextualization is very important, because nowadays we see the idea of untouchability being expanded to various other things, but I don't know how that is going to really impact the original context.
I would like to, take one last issue before we open out. I think one of the core chapters in your book is on caste large-scale massacres and caste atrocities, which you have covered. You have studied some of the cases, like the Kilvenmani and the Sundur massacres. And I found that particularly interesting as a lawyer to read the case histories where I think in all of those, you point out how the lower courts had actually convicted or given a finding of conviction, convicted the murderers or the accused, and then except the Belchi massacre. And then when it goes to the higher court and the Supreme Court, either it's hanging in the Supreme Court or the high courts have actually acquitted.
Yeah.
And so what are our courts doing now? I mean, it leads me to that question, that are our courts, higher courts especially, high courts and Supreme Courts, taking caste violence seriously? Are they, or is it that the Prevention of Atrocities Act, which is the law enacted in 1989 to deal with caste-based atrocities, or is the law not being used at all? Would some of these, just brief questions I wanted to ask both of you if you want to respond. Sudipto, having reported on some of these cases of violence, do you think that you see any change in the courts in taking caste violence cases seriously, or the law on the POA Act seriously? And maybe to Asshna, if you want to respond, that would, as an academic, do you think some of these case histories, studying some of these cases would make it, would be useful both for law students and also for judges, hopefully, to improve our criminal justice system? What do these case histories, do they play a role? I mean, if either of you want to respond.
Yeah, for me, when it comes to the judiciary, the basic thing, of course, the question of diversity. I mean, how is a Reddy judge presiding over a case involving Reddy accused? How is it not a conflict of interest? How is a Brahmin judge sitting in judgment over a case involving, Brahminical traditions, let's say? These are things which are, I somehow feel like that's never even brought into the conversation. We get into the sections of the law, we talk about all of these things, about how evidence was tampered, polluted, and all of that. All that aside, that applies to pretty much how policing and the law enforcement system works in general. Forget how it works, particularly with regard to untouchables or Dalits. So for me, that is one big thing. But since you bring this up, and in the case of the atrocities, I don't know if it's connected, but socially, this is a result, A, of reform, because we don't have evidence of these atrocities happening before independence. It is a post-independence phenomenon. It's a phenomenon which is in response to the constitution, to the coming of law, to the coming of certain universal moral frameworks. So this is a violent response to that. This is literally ulti. You're not able to digest it, so that is the thing. And the other aspect for me when I was reporting on the ground is how, let's say if I went to Una, the people who've been beaten up, I mean, you would go literally with the assumption that they would be poor as well, perhaps not so well dressed also. It's quite the opposite. So the Patel, Darbar Koli goons who were behind that Una atrocity, for example, were the ones in tattered clothes, dusty, with not much wealth. Balubhai Sarvaiya, the person who had been the target of that attack, had 2 Bolero cars, a house in which an angan was being constructed. So an angan is basically a place to also meet, to congregate. It's a political space, right? Means tum bade aadmi ban gaye ho, matlab angan bada hai. People will be invited. You baithak karna chahta hu. You want to do this thing. So all of these were eyesores for a bunch of people who have suffered economically because of the farm crisis, because of the collapse in that rural economy, because, in fact, just the 2 preceding years, the 2 farm cycles before that, before the Una attack, one was a flood year, one was a drought year. Cattle had died. Who benefited from the death of cattle? Balubhai Sarvaiya kind of people, right? Chunduru. Chunduru is a place where the railways had set up a huge establishment, because of which a lot of Dalits were getting employed because of affirmative action. And they were part of a more formal wage economy, even if they were not directly employed with the railways, because the railways also, as you know, are the worst, in a way, one of the best places for caste differences to melt away, because in that train you're all one. But also, as an institution, the railway is the most caste abusive, because it hires even today people who are into manual scavenging and all that. But that aside, this railway yard came up because Sunduru is also at the center of Bapatla, and all these places are very big rice-producing centers. So these goods trains would go off from Chunduru, and a lot of Dalits would be involved in that. Now, the moment you have a steady income, which is not connected to the rain gods or whatever, you can afford a motorbike, you can afford a color TV, you can afford a lot of things on EMI, which that fellow who's still living off the land, the feudal guy, is not able to, right? So this is something that keeps coming as a repetitive feature of this violence, which is a result also of a class collapse among the intermediary communities. And this resentment, like in Una, another thing, which in addition to being involved in leather, a lot of Dalits were involved in the diamond industry in Surat and all of that, right? That's again salary, it's not wages, which means you have a bank account, and all of these things. So, yeah, I mean, I remember going for the second time with a bunch of students from journalism school to Chunduru. And on the way, we stopped somewhere, and they thought they could just ask the poorest looking person where the Dalit Wada is. And I said, man, just be careful, that could be the Reddy. So be careful. So that, for me, is very interesting about these atrocities. I know if it fits into the legal interpretation of things, but this anger against upward mobility. Yeah.
So right now I'm teaching a course called Reading Ambedkar on Caste and Law, and definitely, like you mentioned, it is important to read case histories and going back to original texts. And this book especially, I've already taught 2 chapters from Manoj sir's book. The minute it came out, I read those 2 chapters and taught them. So I mean, it's a whole lot of information that even I wasn't aware of, and it's not so easily available. So the point that I want to make is Dr. Ambedkar has also written about the idea of access to justice and the material impediments that Dalits had to come across in order to even, go to the police station or even fight out court case, which was far off dream. So which is why you have such stringent provisions in the Atrocities Act. There is a social context to it. It's not something that is there at random, or something to just make it stringent. It has a very historical aspect, background to it. So, and then he also writes about, like he also mentioned, the social location of judges is important. And a lot of you must have heard this line, Constitution, however good or bad it may be, it's the person implementing it that actually results in its success or failure, right? So I think that becomes important when we are reading about case histories and the stereotypes that judges may hold, and how it depends a lot on the judge's outlook. How the case comes out, it depends a lot on that, right? And also, still going back in time, if we see colonial criminal law has been more of a leveler. Like in the IPC, punishments came about that had to be applied evenly across castes, right? So that sort of leveling is something that colonial criminal law was doing, which again, I mean, nowadays we say that Macaulay and the Indian Penal Code, etc., are all colonial constructs and are imposed upon us. But we always miss the fact how it was a leveler in terms of having the same punishment for whatever caste you may belong to. And that also has a history that Sir has written about, how punishments differed for the untouchables and how that changed over a period of time because of legislative reforms and because of representation of untouchables in the legislature. So yeah, I think, and also just, we also need to start from the point of what is law, and to think of the Indian law in terms of caste, as in caste as law. So that should be the starting point for students and judges and readers when they're venturing into law. And then sort of to be able to appreciate why we have different, such peculiar, unique laws for the upliftment of the untouchables. Yeah.
So we'll take a few questions.
Hi. I just wanted to ask a question, because the discussion has kind of been about affirmation and maybe incremental change, but the title of the book suggests that the pride kind of maybe acted as some kind of resistance to it. Because you also mentioned that there has been a rich archive, but it's not been studied, which kind of maybe is tied. So I just wanted to ask why the title and how it might be connected to your writing in terms of you being a storyteller. Thanks.
Thank you for asking that question. It was a very conscious decision to convey the fact that unlike what you would normally expect from a book on caste, it is not only about the plight of untouchables and how to ameliorate their lot and so on. Of course, that aspect is there, a very important aspect. I mean, they are the sufferers of the most egregious form of discrimination. But what I sought to bring out was that when you look at these legislative and judicial debates, what comes through is that all castes were affected in different forms and to different degrees by this socio-religious prejudice. And they were all fighting against it. And some were trying to use it to their benefit. And there was this reference to the fact that there were battles among certain castes to be recognized as belonging to these aspirational, these upper varnas, right? Why did this come about? Because by the time of the colonial rule, what was already in place, and this comes through because whatever else might have been a problem with colonial rule, they were incredibly good at recording things, which is what allowed me to write this book. It's all recorded, these legislative debates and judicial debates, the way they minute their discussions in government and so on. So what comes through is that by the 19th century, the narrative of Brahmins was that, and there's a great irony here, because they were saying that don't go by what scriptures say about varnas. There are actually only two varnas in Kali Yuga. Scriptures may be talking about Chaturvarna, But in Kali Yuga, there are only 2 Varnas. Why? Because in the earlier Yuga, according to our Pauranic legend, Parshurama already exterminated the entire lot of Kshatriyas. So they don't exist. So this was their way of ensuring that there is a great deal of distance between Brahmins and the rest of the Hindus. So in effect, they were saying that in their terms, among the adherents of Hinduism, they alone were pure. The rest of the Hindus who constituted the vast majority were all impure. I mean, this was the perverse logic at play. So I wanted to bring out the fact that it is not only about the stereotype. It's not playing into that confirmation bias. There are a lot of such, these stories are replete with a lot of these counterintuitive details. And it's also about, what is also counterintuitive is that those who, fight for these reforms are, as I mentioned earlier, not necessarily lower caste people. So for instance, even this reform relating to temple entry, which is there consecrated in 25(2) of the Constitution. That was something that was not introduced into the Constitution by Ambedkar. We tend to attribute everything to him. He was, of course, the one who drafted and finalized everything. But in the course of these discussions, others also contributed. So this particular one was suggested in the first place by K. Munshi. That might come as a surprise because he's associated with in today's terms, the Hindu right, and he's a Brahmin himself. And there was certain refinement that was made to it in the course of the debate by another Brahmin, that is Durgabai Deshmukh, and these were the people who said, look, we can't leave it unstated because Hinduism has this problem. So it took, I found it fascinating that in several such matters, it is upper caste people themselves who come forward and say, please, this is what is so odd and anomalous about our religion. Yeah. We can't just say in the context of Hindus, let there be freedom of religion and religious practices, because that can easily be twisted to mean you are offending our feelings by letting lower caste center or Dalit center temple. So they knew the way the system works, so it was apt perhaps that they themselves came forward and exposed that and introduced such reforms. So I wanted to bring out the fact that in these battles, all castes were involved, all of them saw a stake in combating it, if not annihilating caste altogether.
Can I make a quick point over there?
Sure.
Yeah. And I'll just make a quick point over there about how this liberal Brahmin, conservative Brahmin has shaped this region, this entire South Asian region. And for that, you need to go back all the way to Buddhism. So the radical response to Buddhism, in addition to all the persecution, the purge and all of that, was also appropriation. There was a whole bunch of Brahmins who did take to Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism particularly, and over time, Shankara happens. Shankara is basically, his Advaita philosophy is an appropriation of Buddhism, an appropriation of an appropriated version of Buddhism, which is the Mahayana strain of Buddhism. And then you have the Dvaita philosophy by Madhava and all of that. So this is one constant thing in which you essentially see that it is those intellectual debates which are percolating down and finally leading to some radicalized movements.
Hi, I have many random thoughts. I've tried to put all of them together and kind of maybe have a coherent question. But I was just wondering, untouchability has been abolished for quite some years, but it's still very much practiced despite the many consequences and legal implications that it attracts, right? Some of my friends, we were having a discussion and we were talking about how casteist slurs must be criminalized, and I was of the opinion that they shouldn't be, because I feel like there are many people who don't have access to a certain kind of literature or to certain kind of conversations, these discussions for that matter, who might not even know why they are being sent to jails for using certain words. They might not even know the meaning of those words. So my point here being that law alone cannot change things. It has to be backed by behavioral change as well. And if only seen in isolation, it's going to be counterproductive. So that's the opinion that I hold. But I think, Asshna, you spoke about how caste and law, both things have to be studied together. So I just want to know from everybody in this panel, what are your thoughts, and yours especially. So, yeah.
Asshna,
Thank you.
go ahead.
This time you're going first.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a reason why these laws are so stringent, and I would disagree with you on that account. That um, I'm sure there has to be behavioral change, but I don't think that that is primarily what we can rely on. And if I have to make a legal argument, I'll just say that ignorance of law is no excuse. So,
Yeah, maybe I can also just respond as well. I mean, of course, there's always been a debate on whether change should be led by the law or by society, you know, and this has been there in many battles. Should law lead the change, or should there first be social change and then law should follow? And it's never one or the other at all times. Sometimes law has to lead the change. When you know that when certain actions are, where you want to ensure that certain actions don't take place. And also I think, some of the examples that you raised, that people may not know the meaning and may therefore should not therefore be punished for it. I think a lot, especially in the context of caste, we often sometimes make those excuses. Whereas I think many times some of those meanings are taken as being acceptable. Words and slurs are, we often don't even, often people don't even think that it's a term of abuse, and therefore it's taken as being acceptable, and that's what I think the law says. Also, the way the law is, the conviction and the implementation of the Atrocities Act is so difficult, and our criminal process is so difficult that the rate of conviction is highly, minimal. So I don't think there's really a fear that people are afraid to say this. We still see caste-based slurs being used extremely commonly, and that's, I think, what the law is trying to do.
also, just one more point.
Sure.
Just that the idea of caste slurs, it's also been watered down a lot by the court, because now they say that if it was within closed doors and it was between two people, then it's not considered to be caste slur punishable by law. And also, I'm the wrong person for this question to be asked, because I come from a community whose name is considered to be used as a slur. So.
Manoj, would you like to respond?
Yeah, this thing of what I said earlier, right? Like politics is a form of violence, and laws are a result of policies which are a result of politics, and you have to cut a chicken to eat it. I mean, there is some amount of violence involved in this thing, so punitive action within some human rights framework, I think, minus the whipping and the lashing, there has to be some punishment, and it's unacceptable to even think about these. That's the basic difference for me also between Gandhi and Ambedkar, right? This thing of reform versus reparations. Now, will the reparations come in blood? Will they come through the law? That is the question. What will you have is the question, really.
Well, I would like to look at this question against this backdrop of Supreme Court not too long ago upholding criminal defamation, which is not necessarily the trend around the world, but our apex court in its wisdom decided that it should be there. So if somebody could file a complaint because you offended criminal complaint because you offended my feelings, would it not be a little misplaced to say, okay, when it comes to Dalits, I should have the freedom to use any kind of language, any slurs, and that should not be treated as defamation. You anyway have a criminal defamation provision still in place. So when you do away with that, maybe we could revisit this question of how we could work it in such a way that it's not too excessive. I don't know if it is excessive, if it is being misused. I don't have that kind of
yeah, but I
data
think
in
I
mind.
want to kind of go back to, just raise what Asshna also said, that the questions are always raised that these laws are too excessive.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, our courts are continuously watering down these laws.
Yeah.
So what, using a casteist word, has been sufficiently watered down to say that it is only in public view. And
Yeah.
public view has been further watered down, that public view is where there have to be other people, it is not in your own home. So there are so many case laws which have kind of
Caveats.
completely watered it down. And so unfortunately, even the legislations enacted to ensure that there's no caste-based discrimination are also being watered down. And and so therefore, the effort has been, how do you ensure that these legislations are implemented in the right spirit, our courts uphold it, and hopefully they lead to some social change.
And we can't underestimate the power of words. The Vedas are made up of words. The Prime Minister's power is made up of all those dialogues and speeches and all of that. It's a rhetoric. Words are so important. So.
Hi. So I don't know if you dealt about demand for SC status for Dalit Christians in your book, but that deals with how law and caste interlinks, and Christians, and also interestingly how temple entry protest was happening. At the same time, Christians Dalits who are converted into Christians were not allowed into the church, and Dalits even they are Christians, and constitution allows the freedom of follow any religion. But what is this happening here? The struggle for SC status for Dalit Christians, that is still going on. Why it is not given, or what is the history? Because before post-independence or during British period, I think reservations were given for Christians, Dalit Christians. Why did they stop it? What is the politics behind it?
See, again, as a storyteller, I'm looking at this question. I find it fascinating that post-independence, when we were, framing the constitution and all that, when we were defining scheduled castes, so we had no qualms in specifying that it is something that will apply only to Hindus, and later it was extended to Sikhs, and even later it was extended to Buddhists. Now, by insisting upon, allowing this status, constitutionally recognized status of scheduled caste to be conferred only on Hindus and offshoots of Hinduism, you are, again, indirectly or directly perhaps, admitting that this is a problem peculiar to us, and therefore we are the ones who have to deal with it. And there is this assumption that that once you convert to a religion like Christianity and Islam, it overnight disappears. It's a very convenient narrative to take. It is almost as if they were worried that if there isn't this kind of a restriction, there will be, an incentive for lower caste people to convert without any such consequences. So there are actually, it's almost like reparations. You remain a Hindu if you want to access these affirmative action benefits. So the price you have to pay is suffer the consequences of being a Hindu. But if you want to opt out of it, then you lose out on these benefits. So that's how it played out. Whether it should remain like this or not, it's for each of us to ponder over, depending on our predilections and our value system. Right?
The thing about the politics, I find it interesting that you raised the question of the politics. You might have noticed that Ambedkar was not very invested in the question of lower castes among Muslims and Christians. And, even in the way he proposes Buddhism, you must have read, I'm hoping you would have read the thoughts on Pakistan and partition, right? In which he kind of breaks down not just the political question, but also the theological, religious, social, within the Muslim this thing. And I feel the greatest loss in the subcontinent is what happened to Jogendranath Mondal. Right? Jogendranath Mondal is somebody who was really invested in this question of what caste means within Muslim society, and it
You
is
should mention that he was the law minister
of
Pakistan.
So the first law minister and first of India and the first law minister of Pakistan were both Dalits. The law minister of Pakistan was Jayna Kothari, the person because of whom Ambedkar returned to the Constituent Assembly because of the support he managed to. So Jayna Kothari was with the Muslim League, and he was somebody who believed in this entire thing of Dalitistan, Pakistan, Ek, and for good measure. Why not? You know, this was a violent rejection. It was the ulti from the other end of the caste. This thing saying that we are vomiting out all of this and we want to start anew. This thing, and if you look at it theologically, and this is just my polemics, I do feel that the Abrahamic faiths have a lot more radical potential than Buddhism do, in terms of rejecting lock, stock, and barrel, just throwing that whole damn thing outside, right? So to that extent, I feel like his subordination, the way he was defeated after Jinnah by these Muslim Brahmins, right, which is the mullahs. So South Asia is a problem. I mean, in one way, you can look at it as you know, Hindu Brahmins and Muslim Brahmins, and then we are all just like in between, just observers, right? So in that sense, that complication that Jayna Kothari tried to provide within Muslim society, and which I suppose as an extension could have been applied to Christianity as well, with his death, with his, not just his death, sorry, his political death in Bangladesh, and he returns to India, after which he's not in oblivion. 20 years he contests in Bengal. He contests elections, some 4 or 5 elections he contests in Bengal. And it is alleged that the United Front, which included the left, poisoned him. You know, there's all this stuff. But Jayna Kothari, if any of you are interested, you should read up. There's very little material on him. This is a question I think for which you have to go back there. Yeah.
So I think we'll wind up for today. Thank you. And I think you want to do a photo op before we end.
Yeah, also another thing I want to cheer for, the fact that this book, this inquiry, when we talk about appropriation and things like that, it's by a non-Brahmin author. For me, that is personally something which is very satisfying. So congratulations, Manoj, for this effort.